I see myself as an academic economist first. That's like who I am. But I also really believe in public policy and trying to get policy right for the country. And one of the things for any country, actually, and sometimes I've had the pleasure of being able to talk to governments around the world. And one of the things that is clear is that governments fail a lot. Markets fail a lot. And what I'd like my students to understand is that everything can go wrong, the governments and the markets. But to do that, we have to build some credibility. One of the first things when you take a principles of economics class, depending on what book you use, you will learn that economists hate taxes. This is particularly pronounced if you are using Greg Mankiw's Principles of Economics textbooks. And I'm picking on Greg here because he indeed has an entire chapter dedicated to the costs of taxation. So an entire chapter just to teach the students why taxes are always and forever terrible. And why do we hate taxes? Well, let's just not pick on Greg. Okay, let's bring it in-house. Let's pick on Paul Krugman and Robin Wells a little bit. Well, they hate taxes because they create deadweight loss. This is one of the first things students learn. They get into Econ. They've never learned any Econ before. They're getting in their first sort of 6-7 weeks of the semester. And we teach them that when governments intervene in the market, they create deadweight loss, reducing consumer surplus, and reducing efficiencies. That's our big takeaway. But do they? Well, they do under a very specific set of assumptions. That the market is perfectly competitive. That there are no market failures. That there's no externalities. That there's no market concentration. That the market's perfectly competitive. Now, I believe that the simplest and easiest pedagogical starting point is perfect competition. I know that there are approaches out there that say, oh, the world is complex. Let's abandon perfect competition and go straight into teaching a world, an economy where everything, where there is imperfect competition from the get-go. I actually think that's too hard. And I think that for me, and maybe everybody won't agree with this, I don't have an anchor point if I do that. I like to know what is the ideal world. What are we aiming for? What is the best we could do to try to have something to assess against how badly we're failing, whether we're the market or the government, right? I want to know, is this a big problem or a little problem? When I teach policy interventions when it comes to when it comes to sort of market failures, one of the things I like to assign is an article written by one of the Planet Money guys that is titled, "Should We Tax People for Being Annoying?" My students love this article because we get to start by talking about the fact that there are small externalities all around us. And what would the world look like if the government was trying to get involved in just like your annoying neighbor? Right? And so, that lets us then have a conversation about, big magnitudes, big and small. So we start with this idea of governments creating deadweight loss because of the fact that we're starting from a point of perfect competition. But here's the challenge. We don't make that clear enough. So to prove that point, I'm going to stick with the theme of this weekend and ask ChatGPT, do taxes cause deadweight loss? And actually, you should say, start with, this is the Google AI. I'm going to use both the Google AI and ChatGPT. Do taxes create deadweight loss? Yes, says the AI summary. Taxes can cause deadweight loss. And then it goes through and it gives a definition. It gives an explanation. It talks about the factors and it shows you how to calculate it. Nowhere in here does it say that, taxes create deadweight loss under perfect competition. So ChatGPT has lost our assumption because we've lost our assumption when we teach it. No, so here is ChatGPT, and it gives me a whole explanation on how taxes create deadweight loss. And I'm like, well, ChatGPT's gotten pretty smart, and I can use the new analytic ChatGPT. I wanted to think hard about this problem, so I went in and I said, why do economists think that government intervention like taxes or price controls causes deadweight loss? Aren't governments trying to help people with these policies? That's a natural question that any student might have. Why is government putting a policy in place if it is everywhere and always going to cause harm? Look, ChatGPT had to think for 7 seconds. That's a long time for ChatGPT. It's like, this is a hard one, even for me. And so it says, economists often point out that government intervention like taxes or price controls can lead to a deadweight loss, which is a loss of economic efficiency that occurs when the equilibrium outcome is not achieved. That doesn't mean that government's not trying to help people. Rather, it highlights the unintended consequences. Well, no, I don't actually agree with that. It's not that when we tax, say, cigarettes or gasoline, that we have an unintended consequence of deadweight loss that we're willing to tolerate. It's actually, we think that the externality means that at the market equilibrium, surplus is actually not maximized because there are uncounted costs. So ChatGPT does not understand what we're trying to teach, and ChatGPT is smarter than most of our students. So maybe we need to be doing something slightly differently. So then I went through and I said, well, do taxes on alcohol cause deadweight loss? And look, what does ChatGPT say? Well, taxes on alcohol do introduce deadweight loss by reducing market transactions. They also serve other important economic and social functions. So again, it still doesn't get, actually, no. We're not saying that when we tax something with a negative externality, there's deadweight loss, but that deadweight loss is tolerable. Why is this happening in our AI bots? Because they're trained on the existing economics introductory principles textbooks, which teach this, and they forget in that chapter where they say governments are always creating deadweight loss to remind that governments will create deadweight loss under the assumption of perfect competition if the market was efficient in the first place. So that's my big point. What happened to perfect competition? The AI didn't get it. Economists agree on what happens to prices when you tax something. And it's driving, I think, almost all economists absolutely bunker balls that the public is now having an argument about what happens to prices when we tax something like through tariffs, right? We pretty much agree that if you impose a tariff, then it's going to raise prices for consumers, right? So here, this is a survey of expert economists, and it shows that 95%, 96% adjusted by confidence agree that prices go up. So we agree that prices go up. It gets a lot vaguer when we ask questions like, well, what does this mean for jobs? Or was it worth it in the first place? What happens to welfare? So we're not in agreement on welfare, but we are in agreement on what happens to the price. So one of the things that's happened is this tax incidence and welfare analysis is now political. So here you can see that will tariffs be bad for the U.S.? Among percent who think increased tariffs between the U.S. and some of its trading partners will be good for the U.S., We've got about 3/4 of Republicans believe that. And we have almost 90% of college graduate Democrats don't believe that. So instead of teaching them like how to think through this problem, they're now relying on the politics of it. More generally, this is a study that was done in 2013. What they found was that people don't tend to agree with economists, particularly when economists have consensus. So when we have agreement on things like it's hard to predict stock prices, 100% of economists agree with that. Only about 50% of the public does. Carbon tax is less costly way to cut emissions than car mileage standards. Over 90% of economists agree with that. Roughly 20% of the public does. Right? So we have this problem, which is that economists are not actually convincing people about policy. And here's that same survey was done more recently, and you see the exact same finding on things like greedflation and price gouging and artificial intelligence. The problem is nobody trusts economists. So this is UChicago News, a talk that was given recently, why nobody trusts economists. In policy debates, people have had enough with the experts. Should we trust the economists? If economists agree on something, the public will almost certainly think differently. We're not in good standing right now. And you can look, what I love is I get to stand up here and be apolitical. Doesn't matter which side you're rooting for. They both have really bad economic policies right now. And they have really bad economic policies because we have lost we've lost, I think, credibility. And we've lost that credibility, I think, because of the way we have historically taught government. Let's come back to what we agree on. So while the U.S. has been laggard in implementing carbon prices, the EU, Britain, New Zealand, California is an exception. The world average, carbon taxes, carbon pricing has been introduced over the last 10 years around the globe. And here's an article from The Economist. It's the carbon price, stupid, leading to a decrease in emissions. So what are they basically saying? You raised the price of carbon, the quantity of carbon came down. That's exactly what all economists would predict. Whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea is not the same thing as asking what happens when we raise the price of something. This is not just a problem from a policy perspective, but when we're losing credibility in how we teach things because the students don't understand the assumptions that make things fake in the real world, or the assumptions that make things a useful device, but we need to then be able to adjust them, they don't believe us. And as a result, we get findings like economics majors in their senior year can't pass a basic economics literacy test and barely do any better than non-economics majors. Economics students come into the classroom with preconceived ideas about economic policy, like zoning laws, minimum wages, and tax policy, and their views are unmoved by their economics classes. Economics majors take rational to mean selfish, and the normative view that rational is better. So, this has led some people to criticize 101 as teaching that government programs and regulations are always dangerous and inefficient. Dangerous and inefficient. And I have to say, I think they have a valid criticism if you look at the way AI has interpreted our findings. So think about positive versus normative analysis of government. When you take a position at the beginning that government is always doing harm, what you're teaching doesn't match most students' experience or their prior beliefs. And you are effectively taking a normative position. Government intervention is inefficient, it causes harm, it reduces deadweight loss. Is that a fact? I don't think so. I think most of the things that we have excise taxes on in the US, research has shown is too small. The gas tax in the US is actually too small to internalize the full negative externality. The tax on cigarettes is actually too small to internalize the full negative externality and myopia, behavioral problems of addicts.
So there are lots of reasons why we might think why we might have different views. You don't have to agree with me on that. But we should have some set of agreement on what does government intervention do to quantities and prices. That's not political. That's not normative. That's positive. So when we teach government intervention in a more straightforward way to focus on how it moves the quantities and the prices, we can step back from our own opinions about what government should be doing and shouldn't be doing and focus instead on how market forces move. I teach in a policy school. My students have a lot of opinions. I really like this because I get to say to them, like, you can have your policy opinions, but let's just at least know what it's going to do to the quantity consumed, the quantity sold in the market. Let's know what it's going to do to prices. And then let's have our discussions given that. So why should you believe that government interventions changes quantities and prices, which it always does, with not perfectly inelastic or elastic curves, if they don't believe you that it always prevents otherwise beneficial trades? Right? Because they're not dummies. I can go to home and tell my 11-year-old, and he'll be like, no, people overconsume, something he thinks people overconsume. And so when I tell, the idea that if I reduce, is my screen time limit a bad thing or a good thing in the household? It's a regulation. Depends on whether you think the kids would get the optimal level on their own, right? So they all know about this kind of stuff. And so while deadweight loss is a positive analysis, the claim that government always creates deadweight loss is normative. So how do we do this better? Well, deadweight loss arises whenever a quantity difference from the socially efficient quantity arises, not the market equilibrium. And I think we all believe that. We all believe deadweight loss comes when the quantity is different from the socially efficient quantity. The problem is we don't teach that till later. So don't teach welfare analysis in government policy until later. Focus on how it moves the quantity and the price. It also matches, for me, I just told my students, I'm about to give my midterm next week. Like, we've gone all the way through government analysis. I haven't done any welfare yet. I'm like, everything we've done so far is just thinking about what moves prices and quantities in markets. Your whole exam, one thing, what moves prices and quantities in markets. You guys, you're just trying to learn this one thing. It feels so coherent to them. So, obviously we have market failure that's rife. My students, maybe more than some of yours, come in more primed to start thinking about the ways in which markets fail. My job, because I'm dealing with probably overly, there's a normative word, progressive students who come from a view, which many of you do because young people are more progressive, left-leaning. I need to convince them that government doesn't always get it right. It can actually do incredible harm. How am I going to get their trust to believe me that government can get it wrong? Well, I also want to talk about how markets get it wrong. So we're going to do that through the course of the semester. And that's when I can come back and introduce government. I can introduce deadweight loss in the context of markets and governments failing, not just government failing. Why would we teach government as the primary thing that causes markets to fail when they see monopolists everywhere outside their window? So firms are not always price takers, right? That's like one of the biggest things I have to get over when I talk to them. There are externalities. They know that. People are not always well informed. They definitely get that. People make bad choices. They also get that. Government regulations can impede market forces. It's not that I don't want to teach that government fails. It's that I do want to teach that government fails. And the only way to do that is to teach in a more credible way by first teaching them how government changes prices and quantities, getting them on the side of that, and then letting them understand what are the different things that can move us from that perfect competition efficient place. And how do then these things like interact with each other? So an efficient outcome creates the largest possible economic surplus. Deadweight loss is a measure at the efficient outcome. So here's this idea of we get this deadweight loss from under and overproduction. So I'm not telling them what's causing under or overproduction. So when I first introduced deadweight loss, it's just this is what happens when they're either producing too much or too little. So what are my goals when I teach government intervention in the market? Government can't determine both price and quantity in a market. That is mind-blowing for my students, and if they can just take that away, they have learned something really big. They're like, no, we'll regulate like the price and the quantity. And I'm like, what? Then we start talking about what would happen. Like, are there going to be surpluses? Are there going to be shortages? What market forces might adjust, and how would they adjust around that? That market forces respond to the incentives that government creates. I want them to understand that government is just like another set of forces that comes into the market, and all the market forces we've been talking about with supply and demand are now like in it with government. And I want them to understand that government can't really assign a tax to one side of the market. So I don't know how many of you have seen this. I've spent enough time in policy that every time I work on this, like work on some kind of tax, some kind of intervention, some policymaker says, well, we're just not going to let them pass it on to the consumer. We're going to prevent that. We're going to make a law that you cannot do the price increase, pass it on to the consumer. I mean, there are lots of laws on the books against passing it on. And I want my students to understand they're going to be potentially future policymakers. That doesn't work. And I also want them to know that all of the tools available to government policymakers, taxes, price regulations, quantity regulations, can achieve a particular government goal, like reducing the quantity consumed in a market. And so for them to understand how these three tools work together, that's a lot. If you can get your students to learn all of this in government intervention, instead of just teaching them about deadweight loss, you've actually taught them a lot about how policy works. Thank you.